world. It's about time.
Tonight, cover stories May 1960. Here are Linda Ellerbee and Ray Gandolf.
For the next hour, think of your television set as a time machine.
Tonight, our newsstand is chock full of cover stories and a cover-up.
Welcome to 18 Days in May and 1 Day in April, 1960. A cover story can be a big story or a big lie. What's a big story? In headline form, Catholic candidate from Camelot captures crowd. Recognized royal from Rock returns respectable. Practical princess from Palace weds worker. And this one. Russia says America's spying, and Ike says Nikita's lying. What's a big lie? Russia says America's spying, and Ike says Nikita's lying.
In May of 1960, Life magazine worried a lot about the national purpose. It hired people like Adlai Stevenson and Billy Graham and Walter Lippmann to try to figure out if we had a national purpose, and if so, what it was. The poet Archibald MacLeish said we had more stuff in our kitchens and garages than Louis XIV had in Versailles, and still we were lacking something. Something intangible, something moral. So far as the tangibles were concerned, though, we were doing just fine that spring.
You are about to know the thrill of seeing that which has never been seen before. You're about to enter a beautiful, exciting, wonderful new world. The world of 1960.
And what a wonderful world it will be. America in the 60s, what could go wrong? TV and technology will give us what we need, and if there's a Ford in every future, one day it will fly.
Off into space. Man, that takes real teamwork. And here's a team of junior spacemen with an out-of-this-world breakfast.
We'll get there yet. A little vim and vigor, that's all it takes. Maybe some Cheerios. We know about those things. But there are many, many things we don't know about.
Don't know much about history. Don't know much biology. Don't know much about a science book. Don't know much about the French I took. But I do know that I love you. And I know that if you love me too, what a wonderful world this would be.
Yes, it would. But it turns out the 50s and the Cold War have one more act to play. And this will be a cover story everywhere. Saturday, April 30th. New Yorkers open the morning paper to find headlines about a Russian spy ship spotted off the coast of Long Island. Well, what do you expect from a bunch of communists? The White House. President Eisenhower's advisors know a secret that is not in the papers. In fact, the secret is in the sky. And it is the most superb spy plane of them all. And it's American. It's called the U-2. For 4 years, this high-flying spy has monitored Soviet industry and defense from 14 miles above the Soviet Union. And what the U-2 knows, only the White House and the CIA find out. The president has approved every mission. His son, John, he was an aide, and he explained.
The scheme was that Deb would approve 1 week in which to fly. And then once the week was over, they'd come in for another approval.
In Sirlik, Turkey, a U-2 that was based here, concealed here really, has been ordered to fly to Pakistan and wait for further orders. They come just before dawn. The secret flight will cover 3,800 miles in 9 hours. Taking off from Pakistan, landing in Norway, and in between, cutting straight across and above the Soviet Union. Sunday morning, May Day in Red Square. Back in the USSR and in communist countries everywhere, the 1st of May is the 4th of July, without the white and blue. But with firecrackers, real ones. Khrushchev may not be thinking about firecrackers or parades. Russian radar is tracking another one of those American spy planes. What do you expect from a bunch of imperialists? The plane's altitude, 70,000 feet above the Soviet Union. The pilot's name, Francis Gary Powers. And this is no Sunday stroll he's taking. As he would say 10 years later, the first half hour over Russia was always the worst.
After that length of time, nothing happens. You sort of relax and start trying to imagine you're flying over the United States or somewhere to keep your mind off of what's down below.
What keeps his mind off the city of Sverdlovsk down below is an explosion up above, where he is.
I didn't see what hit me, but I assume it was a SAM-2 missile because it was something external to the aircraft. It was not in the aircraft itself. A second or so later, the plane went out of control, nosed over, and both wings came off, I'm sure.
The CIA had explained what to do if this happened, but Gary Powers didn't do that. And while the plane went one way, the pilot went another, dropping in unannounced on some Soviet farmers.
Well, then one of them took a pistol that I had strapped to the parachute, and they sort of caught me by the arms, and they thought they had something, which I think they did.
They surely did. Khrushchev is still presiding in Red Square. In the crowd, U.S. Ambassador Llewellyn Thompson and his wife, Jane.
Then, all of a sudden, this flurry of activity, which we saw because the stairwell came down on the diplomatic side, and they were all running in and out behind the Kremlin wall and up and down with messages, boom, boom, boom.
So Khrushchev gets the news on May Day, but sits on it for nearly a week. All that's known in Washington is that a U-2 is overdue at its destination in Norway. The man in charge of the U-2 program, Deputy CIA Director Richard Bissell.
I remember all too vividly. I had come back from being away for a day. I came back on a Sunday afternoon. I immediately had a call from the office and had to go down there, and I was told that Powers had been, his flight had not arrived, and he was presumably down and lost.
President Eisenhower gets the news from his staff secretary, General Andrew Goodpaster.
He simply took it and said, well, he would want to be kept informed, and I think we left it at that. I believe I told him the winds may blow, and he said, well, we've always known that. Neither he nor I, or anyone, I guess, thought to ask the question, could the pilot have survived?
The next day, Goodpaster and Eisenhower discussed something that the CIA director had once said about U-2 pilots.
Allen Dulles absolutely assured us that the man was well paid. He knew what the risks were, that if anything would transpire that would indicate his being captured, the plane would self-destruct. You can't ask somebody to shoot himself or shoot himself in the head. No, the plane would self-destruct.
Confident that Powers has not survived, the president approves an old CIA cover story, read that lie, which says that a weather plane out of Turkey is missing. Tuesday, May 3rd. The cover story, which has been leaked by Washington, makes its way to the United Press International newsroom in New York and is put out on the wires. On the afternoon of the 3rd, Eisenhower is reviewing the troops and attending military maneuvers at Fort Benning, Georgia. If we're worried about the Soviets outstripping us, you wouldn't know it from this, nor from a song in the top 10 extolling our exploits in World War II.
We found that German battleship was making such a fuss. We had to sink the Bismarck cause the world depends on us.
We hit the deck a-running and we spun those guns around. Yeah, we found that mighty Bismarck and we couldn't cut her down.
So far, Eisenhower has heard nothing from Moscow about the U-2. He doesn't care much for that phony cover story, but maybe it has worked. No news, however, is not good news. Francis Gary Powers is in Moscow at that moment under interrogation. Wednesday, May 4th. In Paris, work is underway preparing for the Four Powers Summit Conference on May 16th. In Washington, the early edition of the Washington Post carries a small front-page story on the missing plane. In the final edition, the story is dropped altogether. In Moscow, the cover story reaches Khrushchev. How sweet it is, all borscht and bologna. In his recorded memoirs, now kept at Columbia University, Khrushchev savors the moment.
We smiled with pleasure as we anticipated the discomfort which the spies who cooked up this false statement would feel when confronted with the evidence we already had in our pocket. I proposed the following plan. I would announce that the plane had been shot down, but, and this was important, I would not reveal that the pilot had been captured alive and was in our hands. Our intention here was to confuse the government circles of the United States.
So, crafty old Nikita Khrushchev had a propaganda plum that was too juicy to ignore. Later tonight, we'll recall what happened when he revealed that he had captured not only the spy plane, but the spy. But first, come back to some cover stories on a royal wedding and an execution.
Our world will continue with Cover Stories, May 1960.
Welcome back to May 1960. While politicians play with truth in Washington, a play about truth opens in New York. It's the night of May 3rd, before the curtain rises. A perfect time to be at the Sullivan Street Playhouse. The Fantastics, a musical about a boy, a girl, two fathers, and a wall. That's all. Not a big play, this one, but it's important. Try to remember. I'll tell you why later. Or you could be up on Broadway, watching another play, a musical that oversimplifies truth, about a teenage idol who gets drafted. This one is a big play. And meanwhile, for the first time since he got out of the Army, the real teenage idol will be seen on TV and below the waist. That's okay now. There's not a whole lot of shaking going on anymore.
I'm gonna stick like glue. Stick because I'm stuck on you.
If the record raised a ruckus, it came from the crowd now and not the music. The music was milder, and even when it was well done, it was medium, but perfect for television. The party is May 12th. Frank Sinatra welcomes Elvis Presley to the middle of the road, where the money is.
Welcome home, Elvis.
For my darling, I love you.
Man, that's pretty.
And I always will.
We love you, Conrad. Oh, yes, we do.
Conrad? If Elvis and rock and roll seemed bleached white on TV, the Broadway send-up of teenagers, their music, and their idol, who got drafted, Bye-Bye Birdie, was dripping with cute. Critics and grown-ups loved it.
Oh, one last kiss. Oh, give me one last kiss. It never felt like this. No, never felt like this.
This was the first rock and roll musical comedy. The comedy part was there was no real rock and roll in the first rock and roll musical comedy. But there is a song about Ed Sullivan, and that's pretty funny.
We'll be coast to coast with our favorite host, Ed Sullivan.
Creator, producer, Edward Padula.
What we were trying to do was to spoof the adulation of our heroes like Presley, the pinning of teenagers to each other, committing themselves to each other, which caused havoc in the families, and the use of the telephone.
Hi, Nancy. Hi, Helen. What's the story? Morning glory. What's the tale? Nightingale. Tell me quick about Hugo and Kim.
The grown-ups sing better. Dick Van Dyke as the wimpy bachelor. Paul Lynde as the wimpy father. Charles Nelson Riley, understudy to both wimps. Bad memory, good feet.
I remember the first couple of times I danced, the spotlights were up in the balcony. I looked up and I'm dancing and I thought, what am I doing here, trying to dance on Broadway? And the problem with, the taps were perfect. I didn't kick a teenager. I got such applause, but I couldn't remember the lyrics because I would be so panicked. You understand? I got the steps. And the lyrics would be, you know, instead of put on a happy face, I would say, put on a zazzabi, lift out a Davis day. And you couldn't stop. And spread zabu, dabu day.
And spread sunshine all over the place. Just put on a happy face.
Not to their faces, I'll bet. She's almost 30. He's a commoner. She's a princess. Her sister is queen. Margaret Rose Windsor. Anthony Armstrong Jones. No, you don't call it puppy love. You call it good television. And television covers the wedding, fully, for the first time. The royal family was used to being watched, but not on television. Peter Dimmock organized the coverage for the BBC.
The establishment thought that television was very much a peeping Tom, and therefore they would try and keep what I thought at the time were rather petty restrictions. And they said, under no circumstances could we look at them head-on when they were taking their vows.
I, Anthony Charles Robert.
I, Anthony Charles Robert.
Take thee, Margaret Rose.
Take thee, Margaret Rose.
Well, of course, that seems very silly and old-fashioned in this day and age.
Princess Margaret.
Television loves a costume party. Came early, stayed late, invited millions of its closest friends to come along and enjoy the reception, live. Life always went to the party, but American TV stayed home, and this time the Brits brought the bundle. Royal Air Force Vulcan bombers hightailed it across the Atlantic, carrying videotape. A communication satellite could have beat them, but there weren't any. And this was complicated enough.
Takeoff will be at 1200 and 1300 hours approximately on Friday, May 6th.
The pictures were recorded at London Airport and then put onto the Vulcan bomber. Flown to Canada, where they landed, and then the pictures were immediately transmitted by CBC and picked up by the American network.
Okay, roll videotape.
The royal wedding transfixed the world for a day. One American had fascinated it for years.
You got any views on the Carol Chessman case?
For nearly 12 years, Carol Chessman had lived on death row in California's San Quentin prison, convicted of kidnapping with bodily harm during a series of rapes. He wrote 4 books in prison, while his execution was postponed 8 times. All the while, he maintained his innocence. His lawyer, Rosalie Asher.
He was, and it was apparent, highly intelligent. He was also highly volatile. At times, he could be very difficult to get along with, and he could be utterly charming as well. He was largely self-taught and exceedingly well-read.
Because Chessman was eloquent, because he had not killed anyone, because much of the world considered his execution barbaric, it provoked an international outrage, except in California, whose governor was Pat Brown. The U.S. Supreme Court had refused 17 times to review Chessman's conviction. The California Supreme Court could recommend clemency, but didn't. Brown did not have that power.
The court has twice been asked to make a recommendation for clemency and has twice refused. Under any reasonable concept of what is intended by the Constitution, I am now powerless.
If I had commuted a sentence from death to life, even with the permission of the Supreme Court, I think they would have recalled me. I think the feeling against Chessman was so strong. They felt that he was a vicious, bad rapist and that he should die. And the sympathy of so many people around the world had no effect upon it whatsoever.
And so on the morning of May 2nd, as they had so many times before, protesters kept a vigil. They would not keep any more. A little before 10 o'clock, the witnesses arrived. Among them, reporter Eleanor Garner Hanna, who had been invited by Chessman.
The prison officials took us into a little side room and briefed us about more or less what we could expect. And one of them gave me an ampule of ammonia that I could break if I felt faint.
Chessman entered the gas chamber at approximately 2 minutes after 10.
I sat him down. He was 3 or 4 feet from me. And he looked at me, and I looked at him, and I don't know what I looked like. Pretty distressed, stricken, I guess. And he just shook his head, and he says, "Take it easy." And then he said, "Tell Rosalie I said goodbye."
And the pallets as you all know, was dropped at 10-3 1/4.
We could hear that click when the lethal pellets were dropped, and he heard it, of course, and he simply turned his head away and started taking deep breaths, as much as those straps across his chest would permit. Finally, one of the times his head went down. It didn't come up again, and I saw a tremor run all through him.
And he was pronounced dead at 10-12.
We went outside, and it was one of those gorgeous days on the bay. I just sucked in that air by the lungful, and Chessman had told me that the guards had told him that they'd walk out from there, and, just all they could think about was that they were glad to be alive. Well, it wasn't all I could think about, but it was a good day to be alive if you didn't have to watch somebody being put to death.
The day after Chessman died, America held its 7th annual Civil Defense Drill. The good news in New York was the announcement that this time, when the theoretical nuclear attack was over, there were only 9 million theoretically dead New Yorkers. It was not the big story. The big story was a ghost who came back to haunt America, and pulling the covers over your head wouldn't help. Come back yourself and see.
Our World continues. Cover Stories, May 1960. Our World will be right back.
Welcome back to Our World and 18 Days in May of 1960. We had learned recently that cigarette smoking was at an all-time high in this country. And the pill had just been approved as a safe oral contraceptive to be taken by prescription. We were hastening death and discouraging birth. Free will can be as confusing as trying to figure out the national purpose. Anyway, Elvis was back, Princess Margaret was married, Carol Chessman was dead, and the guy in the Kremlin was getting ready to drop the other shoe.
When Francis Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union, he'd not drawn a natural breath for 5 hours. Artificial intake of oxygen gives a man a headache after a while, and the slightest wrinkle in this suit would pinch for hours. You need strength, you need patience. Powers had both. It would come in handy. Powers would pass the time in a Russian prison weaving these rugs, and they would hold together better than the fabric of lies woven by his government and unraveled by his very existence.
Thursday, May 5th, the Kremlin. Khrushchev opens a meeting of the Supreme Soviet with a long-winded speech. Newspaper reporter Priscilla Johnson.
Khrushchev began to speak, and I noticed that his voice was hoarse. After a little while, I heard shouts low in the hall, and to my right, there was an unmistakably ugly sound, and all I heard was shame, shame, and then I heard shame to the aggressors.
The Soviets have shot down an American spy plane, Khrushchev says. It's a provocation, he says, coming so close to the summit conference. It's an insult, he says, coming on May Day. He says nothing about Francis Gary Powers. In Washington, the National Security Council is going through a prearranged doomsday test, rehearsing the move of government biggies to a secret location in the event of nuclear attack.
While we were there, we learned on the ticker that Khrushchev had announced that this plane had been shot down.
But Washington's cover story has not been shot down. Not yet.
We flew back to Washington at the end of this conference, and by the time we got back, of course, this was public, and Jim Haggerty, the press secretary, wanted to know from Eisenhower what could be said about it. He did not know about the U-2.
At noon, Haggerty still knows nothing. But he tells reporters that the space agency will have a statement. Trouble is, nobody has told NASA. NBC News White House correspondent Ray Shearer.
As soon as Haggerty finished his news conference, it was around noontime, I went over to NASA, which is just around the corner here, walked in the door and said, I've come for the statement. And they said, what statement? And I said, the statement that Jim Haggerty said you're going to have. They said, we don't know anything about any statement. And I said, well, the White House said you're going to have a statement. And they were very puzzled, and they put some heads together. Finally, they brought out Walt Bonney, the head of public information for NASA, and he said he didn't know anything about any statement.
State Department spokesman Lincoln White does have a statement. It's the cover story, a bold, forthright, open lie.
The department has been informed by the NASA that, as announced May 3, an unarmed plane, a U-2 weather research plane based at Adana, Turkey, piloted by a civilian, has been missing since May 1. It is entirely possible that having a failure in the oxygen equipment.
By now, Walt Bonney over at the space agency has picked up the cue.
Now, if the pilot continued to suffer lack of oxygen, the path of the airplane from the last reported...
The statement goes into great detail about that U-2 weather plane. More borscht and baloney.
Saturday, May 7th, Moscow. Khrushchev springs the trap. Standing before the Supreme Soviet, he announces the news. Francis Gary Powers is alive, in Soviet custody, and cooperating.
Joe Goodpasture called me and he said, this is about as bad as it gets. He says, they've got him alive.
The cover story was gone then, of course, and a cover story, of course, many of these things are based on what's called the doctrine of plausible denial, but there was no plausible denial left after Khrushchev said that he had the pilot, and indeed he did have the pilot.
6 p.m., Lincoln White can no longer hold the lies together.
Nevertheless, it appears that in endeavoring to obtain information now concealed behind the Iron Curtain, a flight over Soviet territory was probably undertaken by an unarmed civilian U-2 plane.
Probably, the new truth is not the whole truth, but it's enough to blow the lid off the White House. America has admitted spying and lying. A real cover story, that is.
I have often walked down this street before.
On a street in Moscow, Soviet citizens bought tickets to an American production of My Fair Lady. People talked to Edward Mulhare, who played Professor Henry Higgins.
We opened 2 days after the U-2 was shut down. We had a wonderful time to start with, and everybody was very friendly. And the ordinary people continued to be friendly. But always at an official party, somebody would stand up and say something like, in spite of the fact that your country is sending planes over our country, thereby endangering world peace, we welcome you as artists.
Wednesday, May 11th, Moscow. The Chess Pavilion in Gorky Park. The wreckage of the U-2 on public display. Powers' flight suit, survival equipment, photographs. Khrushchev takes reporters on a tour of the American lie. He is having a nice day. It's time for the president to talk. He says the responsibility is his, and that is telling the truth.
These activities have their own rules and methods of concealment, which seek to mislead and obscure.
Now, on that, we were all very clear that the moment the president himself said something, no one entertained any idea of it being other than the meticulous and complete truth.
Years later, another truth. He decided to stop lying, he said, when the lies stopped working.
When I saw what a terrible mess this lie had made of the thing, but it was a lie, of course, I just said, well, now look, there's the truth about the thing, and I did it, and that's that. When you get your fingers caught in the cookie jar, there's no use of pretending that you were out in the stable somewhere.
Sunday, May 15th, Orly Airport, Paris. Eisenhower, fingers fresh out of the cookie jar, has come to meet with Western leaders and Nikita Khrushchev. Maybe.
Well, the president is here. He hopes that once Khrushchev has his say, as expected, exploits the spy plane incident in his own particular way, that the big four leaders can have some of those informal private talks somewhere along the line, the sort of thing that Mr. Eisenhower likes so much.
Tuesday, May 17th. Eisenhower leaves. He, Macmillan, and de Gaulle have been waiting for hours, only to be informed that Khrushchev won't show up unless the president apologizes for spying on the Soviet Union. Eisenhower won't apologize for something he approved. The summit will end before it begins. Wednesday, May 18th, Palais de Chaillot, Paris.
Который совершил Великую Октябрьскую революцию под руководством Ленина. Народ, который построил социализм.
Again, Khrushchev gets to rant and rave as only he can.
Успехом строить коммунистическое общество идет вперед к коммунизму, и вы укаете, вы бодрости мне придаете.
And feeling covered with glory by the whole wretched story.
В моей классовой борьбе.
Across town, Eisenhower faces the truth of the consequences of the lies. There will be no summit, no promise of peace, no second chance, no glory. And that pretty much covers it.
That whole affair soured the final months of Ike's presidency. In West Virginia, early that month of May, two hungry Democrats were eager to take up the challenge of being president. Come back to our world and the West Virginia primary of 1960.
In a moment, our world continues. Cover Stories, May 1960.
Welcome back to the 10th of May, 1960, primary day in West Virginia. A lot of Democrats wanted to be president. Senators Lyndon Johnson, Stuart Symington, Wayne Morse, and a whole flock of favorite sons. But they were waiting for lightning to strike. Senators Hubert Humphrey and John Kennedy slugged it out in the primaries. Kennedy had been landing the most punches, but he still had not proved that a Catholic could be elected president. In West Virginia, 95% Protestant, with its coal miners and its poverty, JFK would be severely tested here. And here, Hubert Humphrey would make his final stand. Humphrey was an old-fashioned New Deal Democrat, and these were his people.
In a cavern down by a canyon, excavating for a mine, there lived a miner.
West Virginia was poor, hungry, and Protestant. And Hubert Humphrey, who had shown unexpected strength against the rich Catholic John F. Kennedy in Wisconsin a month before, was confident.
I'm gonna vote for Hubert Humphrey. Gonna vote for Hubert Humphrey. I'm gonna vote for Hubert Humphrey. He's the man for you and me. He makes everybody happy. He makes everybody happy. He makes everybody happy.
Humphrey was a seasoned campaigner, but he was up against something here that, well, let Jimmy Wolford describe it. He wrote Humphrey's campaign song.
He's the man for you and me.
The Kennedy organization, I don't know, it seemed to me as they were like Harvard, and the Humphrey organization in West Virginia was like a state-sponsored school. And the Kennedy people were like, not that the Humphrey people didn't have hip people. They did have hip people. They had knowledgeable people. They had good political pros with them and everything like that. But there was an entirely different breeze that came from the Kennedys. There was a different excitement. It was always like every day they wrote a new song.
Well, Jack be nimble, Jack be quick. Jack jumped over the candlestick. He jumped so high up above, he landed in the cradle of love.
Kennedy poured money into the campaign, hopped from town to town in his own airplane. Humphrey rode the bus. West Virginia had the highest unemployment rate in the country, and Kennedy had his eyes open. His press secretary was Pierre Salinger.
I think West Virginia had a prime effect on John Kennedy. It was in West Virginia that he discovered poverty. He went to visit coal mines. And there he saw people who were really hungry in America, people living in a state of life that he'd never seen before. And I think it deeply affected him.
Area redevelopment bill.
The candidates debated on television and pretty much agreed on the issues. Humphrey's campaign was broke, and this was about the only way he could get on television. His opponent had charm and a beautiful wife and the money to put them across.
Senator Kennedy can be our next president. It's up to you. Vote Kennedy for president, May 10th.
The following is a paid political telecast paid for by the West Virginians for Kennedy Committee. If you would like to ask the senator a question, just call the senator's attractive wife, Jacqueline, at Cedar 2-5980.
I supported the coal research bill, which the president vetoed.
I can say here that had the area redevelopment program been adopted...
Humphrey thought he was running a campaign against a rich kid, but the issue switched to Kennedy's religion. And now, to oppose Kennedy was to run the risk of being thought a bigot. Plenty ran the risk.
You would be divided between two loyalties to your church and to your state if you were to be elected president.
The question is whether I think that if I were elected president...
Kennedy realized this was a crucial time. No Catholic had ever been elected president. And it wasn't going to happen in 1960 if he couldn't get by the religion thing. He had to get them to accept or ignore his religion. But if he could do it in West Virginia, then he could do it. Kennedy's advisor, Ted Sorensen.
Kennedy decided to confront the religious issue directly in a speech to the American Society of Newspaper Editors that was delivered in Washington at the time of the West Virginia campaign.
I am not the Catholic candidate for the presidency. I do not speak for the Catholic Church on matters of public policy, and no one in the church speaks for me.
He decided to confront it directly in call-in television and radio shows in which he appeared inside of West Virginia.
As a Catholic, wouldn't the Pope or the bishop or priest be telling you what to do if you became president? Certainly not. No, the Pope, nor any bishop, nor any priest would attempt to tell me what to do in my public office, and if they did, I would have to say to him that I am going to maintain my oath of office.
Humphrey tried to avoid the religious question, but it didn't work out that way.
I'll never forget it as long as I live. A black lady, she was talking to Senator Humphrey, and they were into the civil rights thing, you know. And she was telling him what a wonderful man he was and everything. And he said, well, you know, I'm doing what I feel I have to do. And someone standing behind her said, you'll certainly win West Virginia because there ain't nobody going to vote for no Catholic. And Hubert Humphrey looked at him and he said, I don't want to become President of the United States because Jack Kennedy is a Catholic. And he pointed at him and he said, and I don't want your vote if you're voting for me because Jack Kennedy is a Catholic.
Still, it began to look like Humphrey would have the votes of more than one person in West Virginia who wasn't going to vote for no Catholic. Humphrey looked like the winner, Kennedy's own polls, and his campaign director, Larry O'Brien, said so.
How do you feel on Sunday? 48 hours, whatever it was before primary, when your own polls show you're going to lose. It was a dreary day, and we reflected the day, I guess. And we sat there. And I'll tell you, we were depressed. Primary day came. Again, as I recall, dreary weather, early rain. Our attitude hadn't changed very much. That night, precincts were reporting overwhelming Hubert lead, but that quickly turned, and the overwhelming leads by precincts started to turn to Kennedy. And it turned out to be probably the easiest election night I've ever experienced.
Humphrey headquarters in West Virginia. The state that was supposed to stop Kennedy had just given him 61% of the vote and stopped Hubert Humphrey instead.
We'd been out working all day, cold and rainy, and ice and snow, and I got in quite late that evening. And Senator Humphrey came in behind me with some of his Washington aides. And then he walked up very impromptu to a microphone. He started to make his little concession speech saying, it's over.
Now, I am no longer a candidate
for the Democratic presidential nomination. I want to thank all of you, too. You've been very good people.
And I was standing there with the guitar. I wasn't really going to sing any songs or anything like that. Then all at once I looked at him and he looked at me. I thought I saw tears, and I started, I'm going to vote for Hubert Humphrey. I'm going to vote for Hubert Humphrey. I'm going to vote for Hubert Humphrey. He's the man for you and me. He'll make everybody happy. He'll make everybody happy. Somewhere around the word happy, I looked in his eyes, and he looked like he was crying, and I just broke down and started crying.
Hey, Jimmy.
And he came over to me and he said, oh, that's all right, Jimmy. Everything will be okay, Jimmy. He told me later, he said, you did my crying for me.
One story ends. One story ends happily.
I want tonight to express my thanks to the people of West Virginia for their fairness, their confidence, and for their support.
That night, it was clear to me that the people of West Virginia had determined the Democratic nominee for President of the United States. And as the dawn broke over West Virginia, and I didn't sleep, I concluded I could identify the next President of the United States.
Give Larry O'Brien an A in prophecy. Come back to the other legacies of our world, to some of the fine print that followed the cover stories of May 1960.
There's fact, and then there's truth. For example, the calendar said it was the 60s, perhaps the biggest cover story of them all, because in spirit, it was still the 50s. Consider how that might have affected stories from 18 days in May and 1 day in April, 1960. Because where you are in time spiritually changes where you go from there.
Don't want your love anymore.
Princess Margaret and Anthony Armstrong Jones were divorced in 1978. Television coverage of subsequent royal weddings, live now by satellite, is up close and personal and head-on. And we could hear both Diana Spencer and Sarah Ferguson grapple with the names of their royal grooms.
Take thee, Charles Philip Arthur George.
Take thee, Philip Charles Arthur George.
Take thee, Andrew Albert Christian Edward.
Take thee, Andrew Albert Christian Edward.
The order of the 4th Judicial District Court of the state of Utah has been carried out. Gary Mark Gilmore is dead.
Like Chessman and others. The protests have stopped nothing, but many states have replaced electric chairs, gas chambers, with the lethal injection table and called it progress.
Do you plead guilty to the charges listed?
Yes, I plead guilty.
Francis Gary Powers was convicted of spying by a Soviet court and sentenced to 10 years in prison. In 1962, he was exchanged for Rudolf Abel, a Soviet spy, in Berlin. Powers, who became a TV helicopter reporter in Los Angeles and died in a crash in 1977, will be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross posthumously next fall. After the summit conference failed, Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge accused the Soviets of bugging our embassy in Moscow. This year, the Soviets have apparently bugged the new American embassy as it was being built, and they say that their buildings in this country are nests of bugs.
A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
Cover stories are still coming apart, and presidents are still taking the rap when they have run out of options.
Let me say first that I accept the nomination of the Democratic Party.
John Fitzgerald Kennedy would be the cover story of the year, and Jimmy Wolford would cover his bets. Words were easier to change than tunes anyway.
I'm gonna vote for John Kennedy. Gonna vote for John Kennedy. I'm gonna vote for John Kennedy. He's the man for you and me.
Well, there it is the way it was in May of 1960. During that period, an American defector named Lee Harvey Oswald was working in a radio and TV factory in Minsk. Oswald became as disenchanted with the Soviet Union as he was with the United States, came back to this country, and on a November day in 1963, snuffed out John Kennedy's life and Camelot, and maybe our national purpose. Kennedy began the Peace Corps, prodded us toward the moon, aroused our conscience on civil rights. That probably didn't add up to a national purpose, but it gave us something to look forward to besides microwave popcorn or a new Toyota.
I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Historian Will Durant wrote that civilization is a stream with banks, a stream filled with people killing, stealing, shouting, and doing things historians record, while on the banks, unnoticed, people build homes, make love, raise children, sing songs, even write poetry. He said the story of civilization is the story of what happened on the banks. I offer, as proof he's right, my favorite play, a little seemingly unimportant thing called The Fantastics. Barely a story, much less a cover story, when it opened that May of 1960. But while Eisenhower, Khrushchev, Powers, Presley, Kennedy, Humphrey, the 60s, the 70s, and more than half the 80s are long gone, The Fantastics is still around, still at the Sullivan Street Playhouse, 27 years, May 1987, the longest running play in America. But then The Fantastics is about what happens on the banks. It's nice to remember. And so it goes. Also during that 18 days in May and 1 day in April 1960,
the U.S. nuclear submarine Triton completed an underwater trip around the world. It took 84 days.
the Soviet Union launched a 5-ton space satellite with a dummy cosmonaut aboard.
Lunch counters at 6 department stores and variety stores in Nashville were desegregated after 3 months of sit-in demonstrations and boycotts.
Philanthropist John D. Rockefeller, Jr. died. In his lifetime, he had given away $475 million.
Prince Ali Khan, playboy and diplomat, was killed in an auto accident near Paris. He was 48.
The average price of an appendectomy in Cleveland was $137.50.